Sego. In today's video I'm going to talk about bows. I've brought 5 bows that I've made and we're going to go through them one at a time. To begin with, I want to talk about the idea of regional styles. Over here things could not be so easily defined as one might like them to be. There is no one Iroquoian style of bow. Instead there were a dozen or so different styles of bow which were also used by people's surroundings such as the Ojibwe. Every style is suited to a different context, and today we're going to look at some of those contexts. To begin with, we have the Warbo. This is quite a substantial bow, and it draws at over 80 pounds. It stands about 5'6" or so, though they were sometimes a little bit taller. The limbs are about as broad as my palm. This is to do with the wood being used. Ash has got a lot of flex, but it doesn't have a lot of stretch, so the thicker you make it, the more likely it is to break. A bow like this would not be used for hunting. It's simply too powerful for this. This is designed for shooting arrows a very long distance and through clothing and armor. You don't want an arrow to go all the way through the deer. If a deer has an arrow stuck in it, it's not going to be able to move properly. If it can't move properly, you're going to have an easier time following it and catching it. Whereas if the deer is able to continue to move, it will be able to run away into the woods and die in some place where you can't find it. This is the simplest of the 3 styles of warbow that were used in this period. This next bow is made in more or less the same style, mostly just scaled down a little bit. When it was new, it drew at about 45 pounds or so, and unstrung it stands at about 5'5" or so. The limbs are about 3 fingers broad. So to reiterate, this is more or less the same as the warbow, but scaled back into hunting bow proportions. We'll talk more about that later on. This bow here is again the same style of bow, but scaled down to its logical extreme. And it only draws to about 10 or 15 pounds. It's only about 3'9" or so. Short bows can't be drawn back as far as long bows. Tighter circles put more strain on the wood. Whereas the previous hunting bow can be drawn back 3 feet, this one can't even be drawn back 2. This coupled with the low poundage means that this is a very weak bow. However, this is still a hunting bow. It's just not meant for hunting deer. There are certain contexts where you want inefficiency. I did some experiments and paced it out. This bow can only shoot about 15 steps. That's 15 steps maximum. It literally can't go any further than that. So in what world is that a good thing, I can hear you exclaiming. The reason this is good is for hunting squirrels or other things up in trees. If you're shooting a small, fast-moving target up in the top of a tree, odds are that you're going to miss. Now if you're shooting a normal hunting bow, that arrow is going to go flying 200 meters out into the forest and you're never going to see it again. Now with a weak little squirrel bow like this, it's only going to go 15 feet on the other side of the tree. And squirrels and birds are so delicate that it's not going to matter that this bow is weak. Next I want to show a pair of very different hunting bows. Both of these are designed for the same sort of animal. The first stands about 5'9" and draws at about 35 pounds. It's similar to the previous style of bow, but different. It's narrower, longer, and thicker. The other is very different, being a flat short bow with these scallops cut into each limb. Unlike the previous bows, this sort of scalloped bow is unique to the Great Lakes region. I've heard a theory regarding the scallops that they're sort of like a rangefinder. If you're shooting for 50 feet, you aim with the first scallop. If you're shooting for 100 feet, you aim with the second scallop, etc. It's not outside the realm of possibility, but I don't really buy it. I think they're just there for decoration. Just to show off your skill as a bowyer. Look at this, I can carve all these holes in my bow and it's still not going to break. This bow is just under 4 feet long, and historically they would draw to about 50 pounds. Now, even though these 2 bows are very different, they are both designed for taking down white-tailed deer, and they were both used by the same nations, the same villages, the same individuals. So why do they look different, you ask? Well, you use a different bow depending on what season you're hunting. Because the context for hunting changes quite dramatically depending on the season. If you're hunting in winter, there are no leaves on the trees, there's no weeds poking up through the trees. Visibility is good. You can see the deer from a long way away, and they can see you from a long way away. As such, you want to be able to engage them from a further distance. The greater draw length of a longbow allows you to shoot more stable arrows at long distance. As such, longbows like this were used for hunting in winter. For contrast, in summertime when everything is overgrown, you can't see squat. Look at how many steps it takes me to become completely invisible here. Deer are a heck of a lot better camouflaged than I am. They could literally be 4 feet in front of me and I wouldn't know unless they bolted. See if you can guess where I'm going to pop out. If you guessed that, you got better eyes than I do. How about here? Can you see me in this image? You gotta really look closely. Because of how hard it is to see in the summertime, you're going to be engaging the deer at much closer range. So at close range, you don't necessarily need long-range stability, you just need speed. Hence why summer hunting bows were generally short bows. Now I could also talk about the ease of moving through dense brush with long bows versus short bows, but that should be pretty obvious without demonstration. So to summarize this point, long bows were used for hunting in winter, whereas short bows were used for hunting in summer. I'd like to take this opportunity to talk about short bows in general, as they're a subject that isn't very well understood. Until I made this one and started playing around with it, I kinda had this sort of D&D idea of short bows, wherein they're just sorta like a baby's first longbow. So let's go over some of their advantages compared to longbows. To begin with, we'll talk about an area that people might be familiar with, which is convenience of carry. Aside from the fact that short bows are lighter and easier to sling on your back, they're also a lot easier to protect from the elements. Old-fashioned bows don't like to get wet. Sinew strings can become floppy or worse, delaminate if they get all wet in the rain, and the bows themselves can take a set if you leave them strung while they're all wet. As you can see here, it's not terribly convenient to tuck my longbow under my cloak. In order to protect it properly, I have to take the cloak off and then wrap it up, which means that I'm going to be getting all wet. It also means that I can't access the bow quickly. It takes me 10 seconds to unwrap the bow, fit an arrow to the string, and draw, by which time the deer is halfway across the county. With the short bow, however, I can just tuck it under the side of my cloak and it's perfectly fine. You'd hardly even know it was there. Both the bow and I can stay out of the rain. Furthermore, you can potentially be ready to shoot with it a lot faster. Right here it only took me 3 seconds to be ready. Not great if a deer surprised me, but a heck of a lot better than the longbow. This sort of aligns with the point about seasonal bows. It doesn't rain much in winter, so protecting your bow isn't so important. A misconception a lot of people have is that short bows are weaker than longbows. This isn't true. They're weaker for their poundage than longbows, on account of the short draw length. So to compensate for this, you make them higher poundage than the longbows. This style of short bow is often 50 pounds, which would make it about the same power as that 35-pound longbow. One point I never thought of until I started playing around with a short bow was the idea of mobility when shooting. Now with a longbow, I can strafe my opponent pretty well counterclockwise. I can also run backwards, but it's a little bit awkward. Moving directly towards my opponent is fine if I walk, but I can't run. And moving backwards from my opponent is very awkward. The issue here is that with the longbow at full draw, I'm sort of locked into a very rigid position. And if I shift into any other position, I'm not getting the full poundage of my bow. With the short bow, I can keep it at full draw and move my torso almost freely. With the short bow, I can basically run freely. I can even cross my arms to strafe clockwise. Now, in fairness, you can move with the longbow, but you either can't move quite so freely or you have to sacrifice some power. Either way, it's just more awkward. One idea I've had is that this extra mobility might make short bows preferable for skirmishers, but I don't have anything to confirm or deny this. One major advantage when hunting is the time it takes to draw a short bow. This doesn't matter much in warfare, where the bulk of your rate of fire is determined by how quickly you can fumble the arrows. But if you're hunting and you've spooked a deer, you've only got about a second before it vanishes into the underbrush. In a situation like this, a quarter of a second goes a long way. With the longbow, I've got to make a big motion using my entire body. This understandably takes a little bit more time than the short bow. I'll admit my technique isn't very good here, but notice how you just sort of punch forward with it. The right hand just sort of locks while the left hand flings the arrow forward. It's a much smaller motion and it's a little bit faster. Here's a bonus that might be of interest. I was too lazy today to find my gloves and I paid for it. I got a little paper cut from the flights and I had a little piece of quill jammed into the corner of my knuckle. Ouch. Ordinarily I wear purpose-built archery gloves with a reinforced patch. It's just something that modern archers might never have thought of. Anyway, that's all I have to say for today. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed or at least found one of these segments interesting. Bye-bye.